I woke up on day one with a mixture of excitement and dread. For the next 30 days, there would be no Windows on my machine. No familiar start menu, no Windows Explorer, no Office, no automatic updates popping up at the worst possible times. Just Linux. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing I had to jump, but not entirely sure what awaited me below. I had planned this experiment for weeks, reading blog posts, watching videos, and imagining the smooth, hacker-esque life of a full-time Linux user. What nobody told me, however, was that this journey would be less about terminal commands and more about patience, adjustment, and unexpected revelations about how I actually interact with my computer. The first hurdle was installation. I had decided on a relatively user-friendly distro to ease the transition. But even then, the process felt like stepping into a parallel universe. Partitioning the drive, choosing a bootloader, picking a desktop environment TIT, all seemed simple in theory, but every option seemed loaded with potential pitfalls. Would my Wi-Fi just work? Would my hardware behave? Would I wake up in the middle of the night thinking, why did I do this? There was an almost ritualistic satisfaction in pressing the final install button, knowing that my Windows installation would vanish and be replaced by something entirely new. That sense of commitment, of no turning back, was intoxicating and terrifying at the same time. Once the system was up, the first thing I noticed was the silence. No Windows startup chime, no background processes hammering my CPU just because it could. No instant reminders to update. Linux booted quickly, cleanly, almost arrogantly smooth. I opened the file manager and immediately felt a sense of both liberation and confusion. Everything was there, yet different. The directories made sense logically, but not habitually. Documents, downloads, pictures. They existed, but the paths I had memorized in Windows were no longer relevant. I realized that I was learning the anatomy of a computer all over again. The software dilemma came next. On Windows, I was spoiled. Chrome, Spotify, Visual Studio, Photoshop, Word, Excel, everything was just an installer away. On Linux, I had to rethink almost everything. The first revelation was that almost everything has a Linux alternative, but nothing is exactly the same. LibreOffice is fantastic, but opening a complex Word document with intricate formatting can be a dice roll. GIMP is powerful, but my muscle memory screamed for Photoshop shortcuts I no longer had. VS Code worked perfectly, but some extensions I relied on either didn't exist or behaved differently. Even browsers felt subtly different. Chrome worked, but I found myself tempted to try Firefox, and falling into the rabbit hole of Linux-centric tweaks, privacy add-ons, and themes. There's a certain humility in realizing that your favorite tools aren't guaranteed to exist outside of Windows. Day 3 hit me with reality. Gaming. I hadn't been a hardcore gamer, but casual gaming was a big part of my downtime. Steam had Linux support, sure, but many of my library titles were Windows only. Wine and Proton promised salvation, but salvation sometimes comes with headaches. Some games ran flawlessly, others refused to start, and a few crashed spectacularly with error messages that felt like ancient curses. It was a frustrating lesson in digital adaptability. I realized that Linux doesn't necessarily break gaming, it just forces you to be more resourceful. By the end of the first week, I started noticing subtle changes in my workflow. Linux, in its quiet, understated way, encouraged me to think differently about computing. Copying and moving files required precision and understanding of the file system. Installing software encouraged me to learn command line commands. Updates didn't annoy me. They became a choice, a control I didn't realize I craved. The more I explored, the more I discovered the depth of customization. Themes, icons, window behaviors, desktop layouts. It was intoxicating. Windows had trained me to accept the defaults. Linux dared me to question them. Of course, not everything was rosy. Compatibility issues were constant companions. Some printers refused to cooperate. A couple of specialized software packages for work simply didn't exist for Linux. I had to set up virtual machines, containerized environments, or remote desktops back to a Windows machine I left running for emergencies. There was frustration, sometimes enough to make me question the experiment. Yet even these obstacles carried lessons in patience, problem-solving, and digital literacy. I learned to read logs, check forums, and trust that someone, somewhere, had faced the same problem and, usually, solved it. 2 weeks in, I began to feel something I didn't expect: empowerment. Every problem I solved, every tweak I implemented, felt like a small victory. Installing a driver without breaking anything, setting up a custom shortcut that Windows wouldn't allow. Automating a task with a shell script, these victories accumulated into a sense of mastery that I hadn't felt on Windows in years. On Windows, everything was a given. On Linux, everything was earned. It's exhausting at times, but the satisfaction is addictive. Another surprising shift was in the way I used the internet. On Windows, I had countless background services, trackers, and autologins feeding me convenience at a cost. On Linux, the defaults felt cleaner, less invasive, almost therapeutic. I installed privacy-conscious browsers, managed firewall rules, and suddenly noticed how much noise and clutter I had been living with. Websites that worked on Windows because of embedded plugins or proprietary software didn't work here, forcing me to either adapt or accept limitations. It was a subtle form of digital minimalism I hadn't anticipated. By the 3rd week, I was fully immersed. I no longer felt like a Windows refugee. I had my workflows, my favorite apps, my shortcuts, my tweaks. The command line became less of a mystery and more of a toolkit. Installing software without hunting for executables became second nature. Shell scripts replaced manual, repetitive tasks. Package managers became my new best friend. I felt a connection to my system that I had never felt in Windows, a sense that the computer was no longer a rigid machine, but an ecosystem I could mold. Yet even in this comfort, Linux reminded me of its dual nature. There were moments of sheer frustration, like when a kernel update unexpectedly broke a driver, or when a seemingly trivial task required a deep dive into forums. There were evenings when I stared at my screen, willing a configuration file to behave, only to realize I had missed a syntax error by a single character. These challenges were humbling. Windows had conditioned me to expect things to work without thought. Linux demanded attention, patience, and persistence. But oddly, that made the successes feel richer, earned, and permanent. By day 25, I started reflecting on the social aspects. Most of my friends still used Windows, sharing screenshots, sending files. Troubleshooting remotely was a different experience now. I had to explain things more often, find workarounds, or simply accept that some tasks weren't seamless across systems. This social friction was unexpected. Technology isn't just about the machine, it's about how humans interact with it. Linux was fine on its own, but the world around me still ran Windows. It was a lesson in adaptability beyond software. The final days brought introspection. 30 days without Windows forced me to confront how deeply our habits, expectations, and reliance on certain ecosystems shape our digital lives. I had become more patient, more technically literate, and more willing to experiment. I had learned the limits of convenience and the value of control. Linux hadn't just replaced Windows, it had changed my relationship with computing. I could do almost everything I could do on Windows, sometimes better, sometimes differently, and sometimes I couldn't do it at all. But that impossibility came with its own lessons. On the 30th day, I realized I wasn't just reflecting on Linux, but on myself as a user. I had been trained to consume software passively, to accept defaults, to rely on convenience rather than understanding. Linux forced me into an active role. Every installation, every configuration, every tiny error message was a conversation between me and the machine. I had learned not just to adapt, but to anticipate, to think, and to question. The frustrations had been real, sometimes demoralizing, but they were overshadowed by the clarity, freedom, and control I had gained. Looking back, nobody had really warned me about the subtleties of this journey. It wasn't the missing games or the lack of Photoshop. Those were minor irritations. It was the slow, almost invisible transformation in the way I approach technology. The 30 days without Windows taught me that computing can be empowering, challenging, and deeply personal. That even the smallest configuration tweak can be a source of pride. That patience and curiosity are as essential as speed and convenience. That control, once regained, feels exhilarating. In the end, I didn't just survive 30 days without Windows. I grew. I learned to navigate a world I had always assumed was rigid and unchangeable, to embrace challenges, to find satisfaction in mastery, and to accept limitations as opportunities for creativity. Linux is not perfect. It is not universally compatible, and it sometimes frustrates in ways that Windows never would. But the lessons it imparts, the skills it develops, and the perspective it offers are unparalleled. And as I sit at my Linux desktop now, the cursor blinking patiently in a terminal window, I realize something profound. The experiment is over, but the mindset remains. 30 days without Windows changed the way I use technology, the way I solve problems, and the way I understand control. It wasn't about replacing one operating system with another. It was about discovering what computing could really be. When I refused to settle for convenience over understanding, this is the Linux experience nobody warns you about, and I wouldn't trade it for anything.